Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and get us started right on time so we have the full hour to really be with each other in this piece. More folks might hop in as we start, and that's always fine. So let's see where to begin. I guess I'll start by introducing, well, I want to welcome you all for being here. One of our first live virtual programs. We've done a few recently. This is our first slow art version. So we really appreciate you being so enthusiastic about being here with us, and especially with such a special piece, and having some patience since it is the first one we're doing. I'm sure, as you all may have experienced already, there might be some glitches and internet speeds out of our control, but hopefully the message and the experience still comes through in the next hour. So I'm going to introduce, I'm really excited too that Angela Thorpe is with us tonight. You'll see her. She should be, I think, the first one on your screen up there. So we're so grateful. She is always busy, extra busy now. So we're so glad that she took some time out to be with us tonight. She's the director of the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission for the state, and has just a wealth of knowledge. I think can bring a really wonderful perspective to this piece and kind of help us unpack it and digest it. So thank you, Angela.
Absolutely.
And then other Angela, you'll see her, Angela Lombardi is here. She is my director of outreach and audience engagement at the museum. And so she's here in a support role just to help Angela Thorpe and I stay on track of the chat and make sure everyone's voice is heard in case we missed a comment, and maybe also contribute to the conversation. So just in case you see Angela Lombardi chiming in, she's with us.
Hi, everyone.
And I'm Brianne Senor, or Brie, like the cheese. And I know all of you at least through email now, which is wonderful. And I'm the manager of park programs for the museum. And I also manage these wonderful Mindful Museum offerings. So again, thank you for being here. And just a little bit of the Zoom housekeeping to make sure we're all on the same page as we get started. If you'll see in the chat, I put the Google link for the artwork image file that I also emailed you all. So if you want to be able to view the artwork on your own and zoom in and out and see pieces as we're in silent observation or looking at something together, you can still toggle between Zoom and your picture viewer or Google. So you can pull that up if you haven't already, that's in there. And then you're all going to be muted, at least for now. And then when we're ready to start discussion and open things up for questions, that will be obvious. And you can, there's two ways to contribute if you want to. You can unmute yourself and then use your voice to ask a question. And, you know, with Zoom, sometimes it's a little awkward, but we'll get there. You know, we'll make sure everyone can say something if they want to. But you can also type something in the chat box at any time as well. And then you're also welcome to stay muted, turn your video off the whole time or as much as you want if you'd rather observe. I understand that, especially if you've been on Zoom all day. So those options are there. And to help be considerate of everyone that's here, we have about 30 folks, joining us. So again, we want to respect everyone's voice, and Zoom only hones in on really one major sound at a time. So once you're done talking, or if you're not going to talk, just make sure you stay muted with your microphone. And to practice the chat function, which actually I need to pull up, if you can all type in where you're from, just let me know where you're zooming in tonight so we can make sure that the chat box works. So, and then if for some reason it's not working for you, please use your voice to chime in. Nice. Hi, everybody. I know there were a few folks from out of state that registered, but don't know. Long Island. My family's from there.
Wow.
Nice. Richmond. Sunset Beach, good choice.
Wish.
Great, okay. Thank you, everybody. Good, awesome. And then just a few notes just to clarify the expectations for this program and this experience. This is not a lecture. It's really meant to be more informal. And slow art is a specific style of observation. And there's some tenets to that kind of came over with the technique from Europe. And the idea is to really sit with an artwork and digest it. So most people on average spend about 30 seconds with a piece of art. So we're gonna spend a lot longer. And you'll notice, and in our experience, we've noticed the longer you kind of just sit with it and look at parts or purposely scan through, in a really methodical way, just more insights can arise and a deeper connection with the piece or curiosity can be sparked. So that's what we're going to allow for tonight, this kind of breath and space to enjoy the artwork and, maybe bring up something you've never thought of before. And then another part of slow art is this idea of connecting with each other, of discussion and like really reflective sharing. So as opposed to like getting it right, we're only focusing on factual information. I think we'll have a lot of that tonight, which is going to be helpful for context. But it's really just about exploring and being curious, and there's no wrong question. There's no wrong perspective. So as long as we can just respect that across the board with everybody and allow everyone to share whatever they're seeing or wondering, that's gonna enrich the experience. So with that said, let me just switch this. We're gonna start with a little bit of a grounding practice. So if you can humor me, find a comfortable seat, or if you're standing, make sure it's comfortable, supported, stable, totally fine. And then if it's comfortable for you, I'm going to invite you to close your eyes here. And if you really don't want to do that, at least focus your gaze down and in front, or maybe on the piece in front of you, but something not moving, something that can soften your focus and not be so concerned about the external world around you. So once your eyes are closed, see if you can soften something here. Maybe it's the jaw, maybe it's a stray thought. And just take a moment to settle into your space. And then maybe honing in, zooming in a little more into your body. And starting to purposefully ground. So you'll feel, if you're seated, feel that connection with your seat to what's ever supporting you. Maybe your feet are on the ground, feel that rooting down. And just more and more landing in your body. And then this might help you land and ground a little more into the moment, the present. Take a deep breath in through your nose here, and as you exhale, sigh out your mouth. And soften something. And then to start here, I'm going to have you invoke a memory, an experience of some other time that you did something slow, mindful, purposeful, whatever intuitively surfaces here, whatever really comes up. It could be a walk in nature, spending time with your children or your dog, cooking a meal really mindfully. Just calling that memory in here. And then see if you can also summon the feeling, the effects of that slowness, that purposeful experience. And that's what we're gonna cultivate and nurture and kind of hold on to tonight. Maybe there's some muscle memory around being mindful, being slow, not moving so fast. The rest of the world really moves pretty fast. bringing some attention now to your breath, and take a few moments here to feel your body breathing, feel the breath in your body. And this is one of the best and kind of most effective and efficient ways to find that focus, to find that slowing down, to maybe release all the external processing and stimulus that we go through on a daily basis by way of coming to notice your breath. Just feeling the inhales and exhales in your body, maybe feeling some more grounding and some more softening in your body as well as you do this. If it works for you here, you might deepen your breath a little bit on purpose, if that feels right. So in a gentle way, you might call in deeper inhales, longer exhales with your pace. And you might notice the effects of that focusing on your breath. And so tonight in this slow art practice tied to this mindfulness, the artwork is an object to practice these tools of focus, of breathing, of invoking the senses. It's like an object to call your attention to, but then the mindfulness tools are going to be a deeper way to experience the artwork. And then within all of that, the artwork, especially something this powerful, spending so much time with it in a really purposeful way, can maybe lead to some really deeper reflections and understanding. So as you breathe here just a little bit longer, maybe there are some things that you want to release or kind of shed just to make room for that opening, that open mind, that curiosity. And it might be the events of your day, just letting that go, unburdening yourself. It may be some preconceived ideas around our observation, or even around what mindfulness is. Maybe you want to purposefully let go of any expectations here for yourself or for the experience. Maybe you want to release some perceptions, opinions, or feelings around African American history. Maybe even around the current state of the world. Can you let anything go that might block your ability to learn, to deepen your understanding? Take 2 more deep breaths here on purpose, letting that harness your focus, coming to the moment, releasing whatever you need to. And take your time here, feeling still that groundedness, maybe that softness in the body, and we'll just start to open the eyes, just blinking them open. Maybe you can still be with your breath, and we're gonna switch over to the piece of art that we can really zoom into a little more. So I'll let Angela pull that up here. Great. So you should now be seeing Angela's screen with the artwork, pretty big. You can always move around. If you're seeing everyone's little squares in their head, you can move that around wherever you need to be able to see as much of the piece. And so we're going to start here with 2 minutes, I'll time us, of silent observation. Before we do that, I'll just want to remind you, you can look at this screen or you can look at your own screen if you want to zoom in and around and get close up to anything. But we'll just kind of sit with it for 2 minutes and just as much as you can, all your focus, use all your senses to take in the piece. Do 10-second countdown, so take it all in. And then I'll turn it over to Angela Thorpe here to have us dive in.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brianne, for leading us in this really incredible grounding and then subsequent observation exercise. To a point that Brianne made earlier, there is no right or wrong in today's discussion. We're just having a conversation as friends and as a community. And so I'm going to open up that conversation by asking you, what do you see here? What is something in this image that you find perhaps compelling or shocking, maybe even moving or confusing? I want to hear from you all. And so I want to just sort of open the floor to a brave soul or two to tell us something that you see.
My eye keeps on going to this wheel that's the center beneath Harriet, and I guess I'm questioning, why is that there? What is it really symbolizing?
Wonderful. Angela L., can we zoom in to that wheel a little bit more? Thank you, Anita.
Mm-hmm.
So if we take a closer look, you might see that the wheel appears to be connected to something. What does that appear like to you? Any
Looks like a
idea?
cannon.
Looks like a cannon. Mm-hmm. It does look like a cannon.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. A cannon that is smoking, right? So something that is pretty active. Is there anything that that a cannon might bring to anyone's mind or symbolize, particularly as it relates to this image? I'm interested to hear what y'all have to say.
I think it's the Civil War,
Yeah.
starting out with slavery,
Yeah.
Civil War, and then the woman above has broken her chains.
Yeah.
That's after the Civil War.
Wonderful. And so part of what I like or really appreciate about what you all are pointing out is this sort of like activeness in this image, the movement of this image, right? We see a smoking cannon that perhaps represents the Civil War. We see a woman breaking chains. And so we see that there are a number of sort of symbols embedded into this image. What else are we seeing in this image? Again, that's compelling, moving, perhaps confusing.
I'm interested in the color scheme. It is so calm and it is so cool, but there's really a lot of action and a lot of movement, and the hint of violence with the cannon and the breaking of the chain. It's such an interesting choice of the artist to go with such a calm palette with such a packed scene.
Thank you, Jennifer. I recognize your voice. I'm so glad that you're joining us. I think that is an incredible observation, right? Like, as you said, with the activity and sort of with the violence that we're seeing, even some of the nuances of the piece that are less savory, you've got a very, very calm color scheme. And I don't have an answer as to why, but part of what I think of when I'm looking at these colors is sort of the calm, the focus, and the diligence it requires to sort of push a people through a movement, right? In spite of things that might feel volatile or frantic, if you've got a mission, right? Perhaps if liberation is your mission, it requires a calm, cool focus. And perhaps that's why Douglas chose these colors. Again, I don't know the answer as to why, but I think that's a really incredible observation. So thank you for pointing that out.
I like how there's a progression from left to right, almost like a timeline, and how it's almost at the tip of the cannon is the gap, and to the left is what's before, and to the right is what has come after or will come after, hopefully.
Yeah, I like that. And I like how you said what comes after or what will come after, because there's very much, I think, a sense of sort of starting afresh and creating something new, looking towards a new future. And so this envisioning of a new reality for Black people, I think, is something that definitely rings true in this image. And I think that's even more interesting considering the context of the times in which this image was made, right? The 20s, 30s, sort of Harlem Renaissance era. There's this era is termed sort of the new Negro era. And what that means from a historical perspective is this is a space, place, and time where African Americans are really, once again, trying to carve out and create a new reality for themselves all across the country, right? You're starting to see sort of the very beginnings of the Great Migration. Black people have gone off to war and fought in World War II. And so again, things around the African American experience are shifting, are changing. Art is being created. Music is being created. The middle class is becoming wealthier, and so Black wealth looks different. Black education looks different. And so again, there's a lot of energy around Black people creating new lives and new identities for themselves in this period. And so again, you see sort of that contextual realities of the time in which this was painted, sort of placed into this image. So thank you for that, Leslie, because I think, again, it's really sort of the reality of the artist's lived experience is sort of showing up in this painting as well.
I'm very curious about the concentric circles.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They're a little like, I mean, you can think of it ripples, but they're so neat that they're not like ripples in water.
Right. I look at them and I immediately think of ripples too, Marianne. But they do take on the shape of something else that might be familiar. I spoke to the Harlem Renaissance. What else could this like represent or connect to, given the context of that time? Like, what's happening in America?
Bullseye.
Bullseye? Okay. What are some other things? Targets. And Marjorie says in the chat, I read that circles represent albums. And so certainly music is being created. Jazz is new and fresh at this time, and literally how that music is recorded in some ways takes on this literal shape, right? Like very early recordings were circular. And so certainly it could represent albums as well. I also think it's interesting how these circles are not necessarily centered on the Harriet Tubman figure, right? The bullseye, if you will, the centermost circle is centered on that canon. And so I don't know, why do you all think that the artist might have made that decision?
Major change.
Major change. Yep. As we spoke to earlier, that's part of what that canon represents, right? Sort of destruction of an old way of life and bringing about major change, if you will.
I guess I wonder too if the artist is showing like a secondary focus. Just thinking about painting, how you don't really want to center your main subject, and she's just a little off to the left. And I wondered if the light, if we follow the light, and it's in the center, but it's like almost a secondary focus. So more mechanics. Yeah, I don't know if that could have had something to do with it. The story, I don't know.
Thank you, Valerie.
I think there might be spheres of influence.
Spheres of
and
influence.
rate of change. The circle in the middle is the brightest, and as you go out to the edges, it's dimmer and dimmer and dimmer. Maybe the change is slowing down. Initially very fast, right after the Civil War as an example, and then things got slower and slower.
Wonderful.
And also on the left, it's a transition from tropical areas where a lot of the Africans, they weren't Americans at that point, Africans were located maybe in Haiti and moved further north, you can see by the graphs of plants, and then from the more countryside into the urban areas with the buildings on the right.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ken. And I do want to point out that Whitney spoke to the fact that perhaps the circles and sort of their positioning potentially represent the fight rather than the individual liberator, which I think is a phenomenal observation, right? Again, this is certainly in terms of Harriet Tubman, she is an individual who led people to freedom, to liberation ultimately, but sort of what she was working towards was something that was much greater in the grand scheme of things. So Marjorie says here, I'm wondering if the canon represents the need to use force to gain and grow freedoms. And I think that is another phenomenal observation, especially given the context of our current times. And I think that is something that we see show up in Black liberation movements throughout time, right? The use of force and voice and collective action to fight for, cultivate, and ultimately achieve change. And so thank you for pointing that out, Marjorie.
I also want to comment on the person who's looking at the buildings, the tall buildings. Everyone else, all the other people are looking towards the center. Almost everybody. It's a little less distinct on the left, but he is looking, to me, he is looking towards the future and looking up. And that's a really interesting choice by the artist to have one character who's so different, who's facing a different direction.
Absolutely. And so I want to dive in there just a little bit more, Diane, and this sort of is to piggyback or add on to a point that Leslie made earlier, but what sort of future do you all think he's looking to, or why is he looking towards the future? Why is he not facing the other direction like his counterparts? What do they represent that's perhaps different from him?
Looks like farming and religion.
Farming, religion. Yeah.
Family.
Family.
Mm-hmm.
This is great. And I was speaking about this earlier today, but again, we have to think about sort of the complexities, not only of the Civil War, but what emancipation meant for Black people. When Black people were emancipated, there was not a magic wand that was waved, and it took quite a bit of work for people who were formerly enslaved to create all new lives and all new realities for themselves. And so again, you have people in some cases returning to their agricultural roots so that they can farm to thrive and survive. You have educational institutions being built. You have churches being built, so new institutions being established. You have towns and cities being established, people having families in this new reality. And so again, Black people, particularly doing Reconstruction, are having to start from scratch and create all new lives and all new realities for themselves. And so I'm very glad that you pointed out, we've got a variety of sort of institutions and themes represented, to our folks who are looking left. And I think in that spirit, the artist understands that, again, Black people had the opportunity and did so successfully at creating new realities for themselves. And there's an opportunity to look to the future to understand what even more realities could be for them. I do want to shift gears just a little bit. We're talking about what we see. I want to know, how does this make you feel? How does what you're seeing make you feel? Perhaps you focus on a specific piece of this image and talk about how that piece makes you feel. Perhaps you sort of pull back and look at this image as a whole. But I want to see sort of what feelings are being stirred up in people right now.
I think that the color, of course, makes you feel rather peaceful and like being outside on a lovely day when it's not too warm or too sunny. Mm-hmm. But the image of the lady breaking chains at the center of the picture and the cannon make you feel that there's some force involved here. And they make you feel like peaceful, but strength and movement.
That's great. And that's an interesting juxtaposition, isn't it? To feel maybe in some ways at peace or like you're living in a peaceful space or time, but there's force, there's action, there's activity, there's volatility happening around you. That can be a challenging place to live in, right? And so I think that is, again, another incredible observation. And maybe some of us can relate to how that feels in the context of today.
If you look, everybody except the person on the right is looking either level or down. The person on the right that's looking to the future is looking up, as if the future is going to be higher than the present.
That's good. That's good. Yeah, that's a really interesting observation, Ken. And when people want you to feel more hopeful, what do they say? Like chin up, right? Or look up. Part of what that tells me, and as I've described it earlier, the artist, even though he is part of a collective that's actively trying to create a new identity for Black people, like he is still living in a space and time where Black equality does not exist. And so perhaps that's what we're seeing, right? He too must look up. He too must look to the future for a better life for African Americans. And so again, perhaps we're seeing some of the artists' lived realities once again play out in this image. And I think it's really interesting that it's coming back to this gentleman looking up at the skyscrapers.
For me, it's like sometimes I look at images like this and I don't feel the positivity. I think it's like it's always, our story is one of struggle in this country, and every part of our story, it seems like it just has so many negatives and harshness, and so I see the hope piece. I love, I think Harriet Tubman, I think is someone to be greatly admired, but it also makes me sad that we go through so much,
Yeah. That's real. Thank you for that, Valerie. And actually, I was reflecting on that point not too long before I hopped on this Zoom. I completely agree with you, right? The African-American story, the African-American experience is often characterized by struggle. And I think part of that is because, we don't spend time understanding the complexities of the African-American experience and digging into Black history. I too agree that Harriet Tubman is a woman, a phenomenal woman to be admired. But in North Carolina, we have our own Harriet. We have so many stories, rich, deep, and broad stories of freedom seekers in our state who, again, use sheer will and self-determination to determine how their lives were going to be, how their lives were going to go. And so again, we've got stories of Harriet Jacobs. We have stories of Elizabeth Keckley. We have stories of Hannah Bond. She's also known as Hannah Crafts. These are three formerly enslaved women who wrote narratives about their experiences as enslaved women after they took their freedom to call out the realities of bondage in the state of North Carolina. Part of why I like focusing on these three women or calling out these three women is it immediately debunks this myth that that Black people, enslaved Black people were illiterate, right? In many cases, they could read or write, and these three women from North Carolina show us that, right? So that should make us feel empowered. That should make us feel proud. And again, beyond their writings, these three women took their freedom, which is incredible. We have Abraham Galloway. We have Waterman. These men were active on what we call the Maritime Underground Railroad in North Carolina. They manned ships and took people from place to place along the water to help them escape freedom or escape to freedom in our state. And so again, I think sort of flipping this narrative of slavery and freedom seeking on its head and centering Black people as the primary agents in that process is really, really critical. And that also, again, shifts our narrative from one of sort of somber struggle, if you will, to something of again, power and self-determination. So thank you for that, Valerie. And we are on the same page. We're on the same wavelength.
Angela, could you mention those 3 women's names again?
Yes. So Harriet Jacobs, she was enslaved in Edenton, North Carolina. We have Elizabeth Keckley. She was enslaved in North Carolina. She is well known for being a dressmaker to a president's wife that I cannot call right now. And then finally, we have Hannah Crafts / Hannah Bond. If you search either one of those names, you will be able to find her. She changed her last name so as not to be identified in the narrative that she wrote.
Awesome. Thank
I
you.
think it was Mary Todd Lincoln that she was dressmaker for.
Thank you, Jennifer. So what else are we feeling as we look at this piece?
I was just looking at the smaller little image on the side of my screen, the postage stamp side one. And striking when you look at it smaller is this big ray of light that comes across the central figure with her chains, her arm with the broken chains raised. And it almost reminds me of artwork of Moses receiving the 10 Commandments and things like that, with the central figure standing up and the ray of light coming down from heaven.
Yeah, I like that you said this. And do you know what Harriet Tubman was sometimes referred to as? Do you know what one of her nicknames was? Moses.
Yeah.
Moses, which is so powerful, right? That her in the spotlight breaking the chains made you think of that biblical reference, and it's her lived experience, her actual work that actually enabled that specific name to become one of her foremost nicknames. So again, another amazing observation. I would like to point out too, we have been talking a lot about direction, and it took me a minute to realize this. Harriet is looking back, but she is moving forward. And so her body is literally positioned in 2 different directions, which I think is interesting as well. Yeah, and you're right, they're following her. They're following her.
I would just like to point out that the look like 2 women on the left side, one's carrying something on her head and the other one's carrying something on her back. I think it's important to realize that that may be just the way things were in the society, that the beautiful society that they had, and the way they made their living and the way they survived prior to coming to other countries as slaves. And they had their customs, they had their artwork, they had their language, and they survived, and everybody had their role. It was a very well-defined society, and this part makes me think this is before the chains, before the slavery, and I don't see it as negative in terms of hard work. I just see this as the way, at least I'm seeing that might be many years prior to slavery.
Yes, absolutely. I like the point that you've made, Brooke, and I actually want to sort of build on that a bit. You're exactly right in that the transition from the continent to the Americas did not, how do I put this? Did not discount African traditions, African cultural retentions. It's really, really phenomenal, exciting, and moving to understand and to see how enslaved peoples retained that very rich, deep heritage in everything from dance to food, and in some cases, language. In North Carolina, and actually from North Carolina down to Florida, there are peoples called Gullah Geechee peoples. Some of us might have heard of these people. They're I think more well known in places like Georgia and South Carolina, but there are Gullah Geechee communities again here in North Carolina too. Part of what is fascinating about that culture, which again we as North Carolinians have connection to, is these were enslaved peoples who in many cases were isolated, especially in Georgia, especially in South Carolina. If you've heard of the Sea Islands, these are small islands off of the coasts of these states where enslavers built plantations, right? And you can think if a people is taken there and sort of left there, and they have a very strong connection, again, to the African continent, and they're not being influenced by many other people or traditions, they're going to retain much of that. And so Gullah Geechee people, they have language that has strong African connections. They've got food that has strong African connections and other cultural traditions. It's fascinating. I was in Charleston, South Carolina a couple of years ago, not too far from a Gullah Geechee community, talking to some members of that community, and even the accents and the words they use to this day that are so connected to those traditions are absolutely fascinating. And so you see this in a number of other ways in enslaved populations across the country and even in our state. And so once again, just hats off to you, Brooke, for just noting that those traditions are not lost even as people transition over space, place, and time. So thank you for that. So I want to go ahead.
I saw Diane in the chat. Did you want us to zoom in on a certain area to talk about the horizontal person you see people carrying, or did you?
Yeah, that would be great. I don't, because it seems like we talked about the part where they're carrying things and it seems we can interpret it in a positive way. But this part here, when you get closer to Harriet Tubman, it's more mysterious and it's more troubling to me. I feel like we're starting to see the pain, and I don't know what's going on with the person who's being held, and whether it's a child, I'm not sure. But
is this the right area here?
Yes,
Exactly.
okay,
good. Okay.
And I'm pointing at it. It's not very helpful. But
right. Yeah, Diane, I thank you for pointing that out. I was hoping somebody would. You know, I interpret this being as a child. That is what I see. That is also what I see to the left of this individual. Again, Angela Thorpe sees two children. One is very clearly in bondage, right? His chains are upon what to me appear to be his little feet, or their little feet. And so again, in understanding the realities, the complexities, and the horrors of slavery, children were enslaved as well, right? Children were born into slavery, bought and sold as property, torn from their families because they were considered property. And so again, this is something that is absolutely heinous. It's heartbreaking. It's unfathomable to us today. However, it was, again, a horrible reality. And to understand that the most innocent of us all were treated in this way, were viewed as property, chains put around their feet, their wrists. That, for me, is part of the energy of this piece, right? As I look at this, again, what I perceive to be a child with chains upon his feet, and just above him, we see Harriet breaking those chains. That sends a message to me that this is to be no more, that this is to be a system that is no longer passed through through mothers down to their children. That's part of what this says to me.
I wanted to mention the wilderness piece of the painting.
Okay.
I've been reading a book, Braving the Wilderness by Brene Brown, and that stood out to me because I forgot who mentioned earlier about it kind of feeling peaceful, but at the same time kind of scary. And so in this book, she talks about how wilderness is something that we fear, but we seek out to go through this physical or spiritual journey. And so that's what I take from this painting. Like, everyone kind of is going through their journey, and maybe the man who's looking up at the buildings is, somewhere else looking in the future and his own journey of true belonging. So that's what I'm feeling with this, especially since I'm reading that book right now.
Wonderful. Thank you for pointing that out. And I just think, to your point, it's really interesting to me how much, I guess you would say, like, flora is at the forefront of this piece, literally in every corner, if you will, and even at the bottom of the piece, from these leaves to what appears to me to be jagged grass. And so this concept of wilderness sort of being ever present as one or a people move through a very intensive journey is an interesting one. So thank you for bringing that to the forefront. Oh, I really like this point. I don't know who made it. It says Galaxy S9. So whoever is on their phone, thank you. But Harriet's body position reminds them of dancing and movements of worship dancing at a church in Nigeria when they visited. Again, I think that's a wonderful point, and that is a tradition that you still see in the Black church to this day, from praise dancers to what we call liturgical dancers. You're right, the body positioning and sort of how she's moving, again, is reminiscent of that type of movement, but again, is a tradition that you see to this day. Someone says, Diane says, I'm really struck by the way the people on the left are climbing a hill. Diagonals are so powerful. I do agree that this directional force is very interesting, sort of like people climbing up. I do notice, though, that nobody is sort of climbing down the hill. We see the folks that are looking to our left almost on like a plateau, which is interesting. Okay. So we have just a couple of minutes left, and so I wanted to shift us to one more sort of thought exercise, and I suppose we can hear from a couple of people, but I want us to take an opportunity to like tickle or engage our senses, if you will. And so if we were in the painting, what might you smell or hear or even taste?
I think maybe like salt, like, when you taste the salt in the air.
Okay. Salt. I like that. When you say salt, I think of sweat, right? People working, laboring, whether that be because they're in bondage or because they are seeking freedom or because they're working towards a new life. I think of sweating and the saltiness of sweat. So I like that. Thank you. What else might we taste or hear or smell?
One's in nature on the left side, and then you get to the right side and it feels more like a concrete jungle versus green, organic, carbon based type plant life, and probably water and rain and wet.
Yeah.
Humid.
Water, rain, wet. Gunpowder. Gunpowder. The smell of the earth. Yeah, I think that's all great. Yeah. I also think of that I might smell steel, right? Like what does it smell like when that hoe strikes a rock that's in the dirt, right? What do those skyscrapers in that city smell like? What appears to be a young woman holding a book. What does that book smell like? It might smell like an old book. It might smell like a new book. It might even smell like freedom. Chains breaking, that's something that you might absolutely hear.
I feel like maybe on the left I might hear crickets and a lot of insects and things like that. And on the right I might hear city noises.
That's good.
And you know, it doesn't seem like any of the people are yelling or cheering or anything. When I look at them, they all look quiet, don't they? Either in or reading or thinking or something. But yeah,
they do
making noise.
Yeah, you know, as you look at the piece, I only see like a couple of mouths, if you will. I see mouths on what we identified as the babies earlier. And then it looks like Harriet might have a little mouth. And so I wonder if she is making any sort of noise. But you're right, everybody else is silent, which is interesting to me, especially as we're thinking of this in terms of working, building to connect to freedom and new life. Jennifer asks, what size is the actual painting? That is something that my colleagues Brianne and Angela L. can probably share with us in just a moment here.
Angela, I'm thinking it's like 18 by 36 or bigger. Do you know where? I can't see you. Where did you go? We can find out. There she is.
I'm just curious, is it a wall size or is it a little thing? Because that would influence your.
Oh, she's saying like maybe
senses.
4 feet tall. 4 feet tall.
Wow.
We're texting, sorry. Yeah, and then I know he was commissioned to do some murals, and I think this came from that project. I'm pretty sure, but I think this wasn't a mural. I think it's just a large painting. Yeah, large wall size. Yeah.
That was commissioned by our very own Bennett College here in North Carolina, in Greensboro, North Carolina. And so I'm going to transition it back to Brianne to close us out, but I do just want to share one final thing. Part of why I ended on that sensory note is because that is part of how I do my work in humanizing the story of our African American ancestors, my African American ancestors. I'm descended from people who were enslaved in North Carolina, in Edgecombe County, North Carolina, to be specific. And it's easy to, again, think of numbers and facts and this sort of thing, but when you are share the same blood as those people, right? You understand that they, like you, smelled things, tasted things, felt things, heard things. And so, again, as we think about people sort of seeking freedom, even across the North Carolina landscape, what did it feel like to try to cross the river into Virginia to steal your freedom from Halifax, North Carolina? What did the ground beneath your feet feel like as you walked slowly through the Guilford College woods in Greensboro, North Carolina, before there was a Guilford College, to try to steal your freedom? What did it sound like to hear Union troops advancing on your city? What did it feel like to receive word that you were liberated? What did it sound like to work in the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance building in Durham, North Carolina, right? Just like us, our ancestors felt, smelled, tasted, heard. These people were real and built new realities for themselves out of times of strife, out of times of volatility, and called out injustice in order to do that work. And so as you go about your day, as you connect to what is happening in the world, I hope that you take some of that, some of those realities with you. So thank you for your time today. Thank you for sharing space with me and for just communicating, participating, being vulnerable. This has been a very phenomenal experience. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to turn it over to Brianne.
I think that's the best way to end it. Thank you so much for your closing sentiments. I do have one little tidbit Angela Lombardi shared with me that I think you all would find interesting about. We started off talking about colors, so just to come full circle, the color of the painting. And I'm not sure where Angela pulled this from, but she texted it to me, so I'm going to read it. Douglas effectively connects his use of color with his decision to place African American people in the center of his work. All colors of pigment mix to form the color black. While Douglas's variety of colors creates a robust image, the combination of the colors within his artwork is rooted in a oneness of blackness. There's that. Thank you, Angela Thorpe, so much. This was wonderful. Thank you all for being here, and maybe we'll see you again soon.